In 1897, when a crumbling leather-bound journal surfaced in a Montana trading post, no one knew it held a story capable of rewriting a chapter of American history. What follows is the unbroken, unaltered narrative found inside, one that vanished from all official records, yet shaped the destiny of a nation. I was 21 years old when President Thomas Jefferson purchased a continent. The news spread across the young United States like wildfire. America had doubled overnight, though few alive had seen even a fraction of its western lands. I had not intended to be among the first to cross them. I was a blacksmith's apprentice in St. Louis, more comfortable with sparks than maps, more familiar with iron than politics. But fate has a peculiar way of dragging ordinary people into extraordinary events. It happened on a fog-drowned morning when Captain William Clark himself stepped into my master's shop. "Who tempered this?" he asked, lifting a horseshoe I had forged the night before. "I did, sir," I answered, trying to hide the burn blister on my palm. Clark studied the metal, turned it in the light, then gave a slow nod. "What's your name, son?" "Elias Turner." "Well, Turner, how would you like the chance to hammer your name into history?" Those words, simple, absurd, impossible, became the spark that set my life ablaze. The Corps of Discovery was unlike any expedition America had ever mounted. Soldiers, interpreters, hunters, boatmen, and map makers filled its ranks. I was neither soldier nor scientist, yet the captains insisted a skilled blacksmith was essential. "You'll keep men armed, tools sharp, and trade goods valuable," Lewis told me. "Steel speaks every language." When I signed my name on the enlistment ledger, I did not realize I had also signed away the comforts of civilization. We departed on May 14, 1804, pushing our keel boat up the Missouri River. The air was thick with spring, the current stubborn as a mule. My hands blistered as I worked the oars, but the rhythm soon became familiar. We were fewer than 50 men heading into a land larger than logic, and yet none of us doubted we would reach the Pacific. The Missouri was a snake of silver under a sky that refused to end. Days bled into one another, rowing, scouting, hunting, forging, repairing. My role evolved quickly. When a rifle misfired, it was my problem. When an axe dulled, my anvil sang. When trade required something of metal, knives, fish hooks, arrowheads, my hands shaped the currency. But nothing could have prepared me for the night we first heard drums. Not close, not threatening, but steady, distant, like a heartbeat echoing across the plains. The men stiffened. "Sioux," one whispered. "Or a Rickera," another said. Clark raised a lantern. "Stay calm. Sound carries strangely out here." Yet the drumming grew louder, and then lights, flickering fires along the distant bluffs. We had entered a land that watched us long before we saw it. It was Chief Black Eagle of the Yankton Sioux who greeted us beneath a sky smeared in sunset. He was tall, wrapped in a robe lined with porcupine quills, and he studied us with the kind of patience that makes a man feel transparent. Through interpreters, Lewis spoke of peace, trade, and friendship. Black Eagle listened without expression. Then he asked, "Do you know the stories that came before you?" Lewis blinked. "We come to learn them." I did not know it then, but that question, simple and soft, was the opening door to conflicts, alliances, rescues, and betrayals I could not yet imagine. We stayed among the Yankton several days. I worked at my forge, drawing curious crowds of children and elders alike. When sparks flew, they gasped as if witnessing magic. One elder, White Antelope, touched a glowing horseshoe with a stick and murmured, "Fire that obeys the hand, dangerous power." She was right, and that danger would follow us. Winter struck the Missouri like a hammer. The river froze thick as stone, and the wind sliced through fur and leather as though we wore nothing at all. Our breath crystallized in our beards, our hands cracked from cold until even holding a hammer felt like punishment. We built Fort Mandan near the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes. Wooden palisade walls, cabins that groaned in the wind, and a forge that smoked day and night as I repaired weapons and shaped trade metal. Outside, wolves roamed the frozen prairie. Inside, tension grew, not from enemy threat, but from hunger, cold, and the weight of a mission that stretched far beyond our maps. It was during this bleak season that we met the woman who would alter the fate of our expedition. She entered the fort quietly, carrying a child scarcely a month old. Her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader, strutted behind as though he owned the place. But all eyes were on her, Sacagawea, young, calm, and watching us with an intelligence sharper than any blade in my forge. We did not know it yet how desperately we would come to rely on her. Sacagawea's role began simply, interpreter, but nothing about her presence remained simple long. In February, a sudden surge of ice broke loose on the river and capsized one of our pirogues. Journals, instruments, bags of precious trade goods, everything spilled into the frigid torrent. Men shouted, Lewis yelled for ropes, Clark cursed the river. But Sacagawea moved without hesitation. With her infant strapped to her back, she leapt into the icy torrent, grabbing floating bundles before they sank. She tore open a waterproof bag with numbed fingers, pulling free notebooks filled with irreplaceable maps and observations. When the river calmed and everything salvageable had been retrieved, Lewis wrote of her. A woman with a party of men is a token of peace. A woman who risks her life for the mission is a gift from Providence. I hammered late into the night, dry and soaked metal tools by the forge's heat. Sacagawea stood nearby, warming her hands. "You chase fire," she said softly. I smiled. "Someone has to." She nodded thoughtfully. "Fire is a good servant, bad master." At the time, I thought she spoke only of metal. Later, I realized she spoke of nations.
Spring thawed the world into motion. The river carried us west again, toward the unknown, toward mountains that rumors claimed touched the sky. The Shoshone called them the Shining Mountains, the Rockies. They rose before us like a jagged wall guarding the edge of creation. Food grew scarce, game disappeared. The men grew thin, tempers thin as well. My forge became nearly useless. Metal is heavy, and hauling it uphill felt like dragging an anchor across the continent. Yet one day, Sacagawea stopped dead on the trail. "I know this place," she whispered. And then she pointed. Smoke curled between the trees. Within an hour, we stood before a Shoshone band, the very people Sacagawea had been taken from as a child. Their chief stepped forward. Sacagawea gasped. It was her brother, Chief Kameawait. The reunion was so unlikely, so profound, that even the most hardened among us stood silent. Through tears, through memories, through stories of loss and survival, a treaty was formed. The Shoshone agreed to trade horses, precious, necessary horses, so we could cross the Rocky Mountains. I watched brother and sister embrace under the vast western sky and thought, history is not made by captains or presidents. It is made by moments like this.
The horses we received from the Shoshone saved us, though none of us understood just how close to death we truly were. The Limhi Pass led us into the Bitterroot Mountains, an expanse so unforgiving it felt carved by the hands of giants who disliked trespassers. Snow lingered even in summer. Jagged cliffs sheared the sky. Every breath burned like fire in the lungs. Days blurred into a struggle of endurance. We slipped on ice, led horses across narrow ridges where one misstep meant oblivion. Our moccasins wore thin, our spirits thinner. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, I saw fear in Captain Lewis's eyes. Quiet, buried under duty, but there. One night a storm howled through the peaks, trapping us in a rocky hollow. The wind screamed like something alive, clawing at our tents, threatening to tear us from the mountainside. I tried to keep the forge lit, despite the danger, despite the wind, but the fire died each time. Without heat, metal grew brittle, tools useless. Sacagawea sat with her child tucked close, humming a lullaby that somehow steadied the men more than any order from Lewis or clock. When the storm finally broke, the mountains glistened with fresh snow, and then we saw them. Dark shapes watching from the ridge. Not wolves. Men. The Nez Perce. The Nez Perce were cautious at first, rightfully so. Strangers emerging from the mountains often brought trouble. Yet luck, or fate, intervened. An old woman among them recognized Sacagawea. She had known her as a child before the raid that tore her from her people. That connection, thin as thread, was enough to turn suspicion into hospitality. We were brought into their camp in the valley below, a place where grass grew tall and rivers ran clear as polished glass. After weeks in the mountains, it felt like stepping into paradise. They fed us salmon roasted with herbs, camas roots baked in earthen ovens, and warm broth that revived our spirits. I could feel strength returning to my bones. While Lewis and Clark negotiated for guidance and canoes, I worked with Nez Perce smiths, sharing techniques and learning theirs. They showed me how they shaped metal salvaged from trade, driftwood, even river stones. I showed them how to temper blades so they held an edge. One elder, Hohots Ilpito, studied my work and said, "Steel remembers its maker. Everything you shape remembers you." His words stayed with me, because I had begun to understand that every river we crossed, every map we sketched, every treaty we forged, these two remember the hands that shaped them, the footsteps that pressed into their banks, the fire and fear and hope of the people who passed. We left the Nez Perce with canoes carved from giant pines and blessings spoken in a language that echoed like wind through cedar. I promised Hohots Ilpito that I would return one day. I never did. But his words followed me all the way to the sea. The Columbia River carried us west like a rolling thunder of currents and spray. Rapids tried to swallow us whole, rocks shredded bottoms of boats, icy water numbed our bones. Still, we pressed onward.
And then, one gray morning in November 1805, a cry rose from the front canoe, a shout that fractured into laughter. "The ocean! The ocean!" I climbed a bluff slick with rain and saw it, a horizon of silver, endless and trembling, as though the world itself breathed beneath it. The Pacific, the edge of everything we knew. Lewis stood silent, awestruck. Clark clapped my shoulder so hard my teeth rattled. Sacagawea smiled down at her son, who stared wide-eyed at the crashing surf, as if the world had been made just for him. We built Fort Clatsam near the water's roar, endured a winter of relentless rain, carved our names into boards and bark, signatures that time has likely devoured. Yet the memory remains sharp as a forged edge, because for the first time I felt the true weight of it. We had crossed a continent, and somehow it had crossed us too. The return journey was quicker, lighter, not for lack of hardship, but because we carried knowledge instead of doubt. We knew the mountains, the rivers, the people, the storms. We knew the cost of the land and the cost to ourselves. When Fort Mandan rose in the distance, I felt a tightening in my chest. Children chased our canoes from the bank. Elders waved in recognition. And Sacagawea, who had walked farther than any of us with a child at her breast, stood beside her husband as we prepared to leave.
History-telling. She looked at me and said, "Your fire burns soft now." I nodded. I think it finally learned who its master is. She smiled, touched her son's cheek, and turned back toward her village, toward her own story, which would shape nations long after mine was forgotten. St. Louis greeted us with cheers, parades, promises. The world called us heroes, but I found no glory in crowded streets. Instead, I returned to the forge. My hands, scarred by cold and rope and stone, learned the quiet rhythm of ordinary life again. Sparks rose, steel sang, and each time the hammer fell, I remembered another sound. The drums on the plains, the lullaby in the storm, the crack of ice on the river, the roar of the Pacific. People would ask what it was like. I would answer with a smile too small for the truth. Because how does a man describe a journey that carved itself into the bones of a nation? Lewis never found peace again. Clark did his best to preserve our story. The men scattered. Some changed the frontier forever. Others disappeared into it. As for me, I wrote this journal in the evenings when the forge cooled and the world grew quiet. I wrote to remember. I wrote so the land would not be silent. And now, if these pages have survived long enough to be read, then perhaps the story survives too, not as the tale of captains or presidents, but as the tale of people who met in the vast spaces between rivers and mountains and shaped one another. History is metal, fire-tempered, hammer-struck, memory-forged. And like every blade I ever made, it carries the mark of every hand that touched it. I am an old man now. My hammer grows heavy, my breath short. But tonight, as I set this journal aside, I tend the forge one last time. Flames rise, orange, gold, whispering. I think of Sacagawea's words. Fire is a good servant, bad master. I understand them now. The fire of discovery, the fire of ambition, the fire of nations, they can forge or destroy. But in the right hands, they can illuminate the world. I close the forge door and watch the last ember glow. Tomorrow, it will fade. But somewhere, from the Missouri to the Bitterroots to the shining western sea,
other fires still burn, and the land remembers. It always remembers.